My guest at this time is Hans von Spakovsky. He is the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation, and he's a former Justice Department official. He joins me today to talk about the resolution of the voting disputes in Florida and Georgia and what lessons we can take from those controversies. And Hans, thanks so much for being with us.
Sure. Thanks for calling me.
Well, let's start in Georgia. That's where Brian Kemp will be the next governor of the Peach State. He was running against Stacey Abrams. This is a state where you have to have a majority of the vote to actually win. So there was the potential of a runoff here, and there was, I think, about a 54,000 vote difference. So on Friday, after all the votes have been counted, Stacey Abrams says she's not going to continue the fight, but she's not conceding. And here's her explanation as to why.
I acknowledge that former Secretary of State Brian Kemp will be certified as the victor in the 2018 gubernatorial election. But to watch an elected official who claims to represent the people in this state baldly pin his hopes for election on the suppression of the people's democratic right to vote has been truly appalling. So let's be clear. This is not a speech of concession. Because concession means to acknowledge an action is right, true, or proper. As a woman of conscience and faith, I cannot concede that. But my assessment is the law currently allows no further viable remedy.
All right, Hans. So the big allegation there is that Brian Kemp won this election based on voter suppression. That is something that Stacey Abrams has repeatedly said, even before the election, that that was tainting this particular gubernatorial contest. And the media pretty much dutifully repeated her allegation there. You've obviously had a chance to look at this. I know the Weekly Standard has printed a rebuttal to this. What are the facts here? What is Kemp being accused of? What are they equating with voter suppression in terms of what Kemp did as Secretary of State?
Well, first of all, I have to point out that Stacey Abrams hasn't produced a single piece of evidence of any kind that anyone in Georgia was unable to vote. The claim of voter suppression is that is pure political theater. It's something that the left has been now claiming all over whenever they don't like election results. Part of her claims, I'll give you an example of one that shows how absurd what she's saying is. Stacey Abrams claimed that it was somehow discriminatory not to count the ballots of individuals who had voted in the wrong county. I mean, they not just hadn't voted in the precinct they're assigned to, but had gone to the wrong county, and that somehow that was wrong. You can't have your vote counted under any state's law anywhere in the country if you vote in the wrong county, and yet that was supposedly vote suppression. And then that shows you how ridiculous these kinds of claims are.
And one of the things the Weekly Standard brought up was that back in the 1990s, with a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor named Zell Miller, Georgia politicians passed a law called the Use It or Lose It bill. In other words, if you didn't show up to vote within a number of election cycles and did not respond to efforts made by the state to confirm that you were still a Georgia resident and so forth, that they would take you off the rolls, and that is what the Democrats are equating with vote suppression. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's the standard procedure that's used in every state all over the country. And the idea, again, that's vote suppression is just absurd. Individuals who not only don't vote for election after election, but then when a county election or state election official contacts them and says, "Will you please confirm you still live here?" and they refuse to do that, the officials have no choice but to take those folks off the rolls, because that's how you get individuals who've died off the rolls, people who have moved out of state off the rolls, and that's the only way to maintain their accuracy, because if you don't have accuracy in the voter rolls, it can cause all kinds of other problems.
So do Democrats not understand that, or do they think it's just an issue that is difficult for some people to understand and they can make a winning issue out of it?
I think it's the latter. I think it's a difficult issue for people to understand. They use these kind of scare stories to make their voters afraid. They think that somehow will not only get the campaign contributions, but get folks to the polls. And unfortunately, I think there are some Democrats who want problems in the voter rolls because they think it might help them win elections. For example, that's why they have adamantly opposed any attempts to actually verify the citizenship of registered voters because they want non-citizens to be able to register to vote and to not get caught doing it.
A couple more questions on Georgia before we get to Florida. First of all, there's the argument out there now, we've seen it from the left for a couple of cycles, that voter suppression is real but voter fraud is not. What's your response to that?
It's the opposite. They claim, for example, that requiring an ID, that's voter suppression. Well, the average American disagrees with that. They see no problem with that. If you want to know about voter fraud, you can check just within the last month. The U.S. Attorney in North Carolina has indicted 19 non-citizens for registering and voting in multiple elections. The Justice Department just indicted 3 individuals in Hoboken, New Jersey for paying for votes. And the Texas AG just arrested 4 women in Tarrant County, Texas. Why? They had a vote harvesting scheme that apparently stole the votes of many, many voters by forging their signatures on absentee ballots. Those are just quick examples of the kind of fraud that unfortunately is occurring.
Have you come across any allegations of fraud from the most recent midterms?
Well, the only problems that I've seen so far, but it's still recent, is that I think Brenda Snipes, the head of elections in Broward County, who's now resigned, admitted that she knows that there are non-citizens on the voter rolls in Broward County who may have cast votes, and she's done absolutely nothing to take them off the registered voter list.
Perfect tie-in to where we want to finish this conversation. That's a situation in Florida. On election night, there were very close races, but sizable enough wins for Rick Scott over Bill Nelson in the Senate race and Ron DeSantis over Andrew Gillum in the governor's race. But over time, particularly in Broward County, those margins were chipped away, and the Senate race actually got down to, I think, in the end, about 12 or 10,000 votes when it had been close to 60 at first. The situation in Broward got a lot of attention because Senator Marco Rubio and then eventually Governor Scott himself said, wait a minute, there's a law in Florida where each county has to report to the state half an hour after the polls close how many votes they have left to count, and Broward refused to do this for days. And so you've got dueling reactions here. You've got some on the left saying, look, we did the recounts, the Republicans still won, Marco Rubio was crying wolf. And then on the other hand, you've got folks saying if Rubio hadn't done this and Republicans and the courts hadn't paid closer attention, who knows if these leads would have held up. So what's your read?
No, I think that, again, the latter is true. These leads might not have kept up, particularly when you see other things, and this was reported by a local newspaper, I think in Naples, that apparently the Democratic Party was sending out forms that had been altered to individuals whose absentee ballots were not being counted because they had neglected to sign them. They were sending out an altered form to fool election officials into thinking that these forms had been sent in by the deadline of Election Day. That's a solicitation to fraud, and yet this was coming out from official party functionaries.
What's the right response here, either from state officials, federal officials, to what we saw in Broward and beyond, as you just described? Because I get the sense that since the outcome wasn't changed, everyone's going to just forget about it and move on. But what should happen here?
Well, for example, the U.S. Justice Department needs to open an investigation of Broward County for a potential violation of the National Voter Registration Act. The law known as Motor Voter requires counties to maintain the accuracy of their voter rolls, and that means taking off not just people who have moved and died, but people who are also ineligible to vote, like non-citizens. And we know Broward County hasn't done that, and so they should be subject to a federal investigation.
So just from the Florida headlines alone, in terms of trying to update absentee ballots and non-citizens being allowed to vote, it makes it kind of difficult to continue the argument that there is no such thing as voter fraud.
Yeah, no, I agree. Or anybody else who doubts that can go to the Heritage Foundation's voter fraud database of proven cases. We're up to 1,200 cases, and we're about to add another 30.
Wow. Well, we'll certainly be back in touch as events warrant on this and other subjects. Hans, always good to have you with us. Thank you for your time today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Hans von Spakovsky is a former Justice Department official. He is also the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. I'm Greg Corombos, reporting for Radio America.